In the year 1797, a woman by the name of Isabella Baumfree was born into slavery with her parents and her brother Peter. They were owned by Colonel Charles Ardenberg of Ulster County in New York. They slept in a cellar with 10 to 12 other men and women. The cellar was typically filled with water and mud. Her mother, Mau Bet, taught Isabella about God and how he would protect her throughout her life. One autumn, her mother died due to palsy, and a few months later, Baumfree, Isabella's father, died as well. When the colonel died, Isabella and her brother were sold in an auction. Isabella was sold to a man named John Neely of New York. The Neelys were awful to Isabella. Her feet were frozen during the winter, and she was beaten often. One day, Mr. Neely tied her arms, warmed his whip in embers, and struck her until her back was covered in blood. She wore the scars from that day for the rest of her life. In 1808, she was sold to a man named Mr. Scriver from New York. With Mr. Scriver, she was never whipped. She lived there for 18 months. In 1810, she was sold to John Dumont in New York, where she lived until 1826. Dumont was kind but hard on Isabella. Isabella worked hard to please him. In 1826, John Dumont promised Isabella that he would set her free a year early. However, she had hurt her hand and her work was not as good as it once was. Dumont took away that promise. In late 1826, Isabella left during the night with her daughter Sophia, leaving her husband and other children behind. She walked and did not run as she thought that was more appropriate. She went to stay with the Van Wagners. Dumont came by one day to return her to him, but the Van Wagners bought Isabella and Sophia for $25, and the two stayed with them until slavery was abolished in New York in 1827. In 1828, Isabella found out that her son, Peter, had been illegally sold to a man in Alabama. She went to Kingston, New York to speak with the grand jurors, and eventually the judge ruled that Peter will be delivered in the hands of the mother, having no other master, no other controller, no other conductor but his mother. Isabella became the first black woman to win a court case against a white man. In 1829, Isabella and her son moved to New York City and got involved with the church. In 1839, Peter took a job on a ship. He wrote 5 letters to Isabella, 2 of which she had never received. The letters she sent to him did not reach him either, and when the ship returned in 1842, he wasn't there, and Isabella never saw him again. In 1843, Isabella decided the city wasn't the right place for her. The Spirit called her east, and she must go. The Lord gave her truth because she was to declare the truth to the people. Isabella Baumfree was no more. She changed her name to Sojourner Truth and went on her God-sent mission. She moved to Massachusetts, where she met other abolitionists like Frederick Douglass, William Lloyd Garrison, and many others. In 1850, she dictated her story to a friend, Olive Gilbert, who wrote the narrative of Sojourner Truth, as she could not read or write. The narrative includes a preface from William Lloyd Garrison. The same year, she spoke at the first National Women's Rights Convention in Massachusetts. In 1851, Sojourner Truth went on a lecturing tour throughout the states of the Union to speak about women's rights. She delivered the speech, Ain't I a Woman?, where she spoke about the women in the Bible, how men came from women, how women can do just as much as men, and that men shouldn't be afraid of women getting their rights. In 1853, she spoke at another women's rights convention in New York. She spoke again about the Bible and how Esther was oppressed, came forward for her rights, and was granted them. She talked about how the king would hang the men who oppressed the women. Truth said, I do not want any man to be killed, but I am sorry to see them so short-minded. Sojourner Truth traveled thousands of miles, lectured in many states of the Union, spoken in Congress, and made many friendships along the way. Everyone loved her speeches. In 1863, Harriet Beecher Stowe wrote an article about her, naming her the African Sibyl, comparing her to the Libyan Sibyl in Greek mythology. As well as women's rights, Sojourner Truth spoke about temperance, heaven and hell, the injustice of slavery, race relations, women's dress, and capital punishment. In 1864, she met with Abraham Lincoln, who was very kind to her. He referred to her as Anti-Sojourner Truth in her Book of Life, the second part of her narrative containing newspaper articles about her and letters from many people to her. She was also employed by the National Freedmen's Relief Association in Washington, D.C., which was an organization made to improve the lives of African Americans. In 1865, she worked in the Freedmen's Hospital in Washington, D.C., where she rode the streetcars in the city to help force desegregation. During another speech a few years before her death, she reflected on how she would want to be remembered. She spoke out about meeting with God. Sojourner is an old body and will soon get out of this world into another, and wants to say when she gets there, Lord, I have done my duty, I have told the whole truth and kept nothing back. In 1878, Sojourner became a delegate to the Women's Rights Convention in New York. A few years later, on November 26, 1883, Sojourner Truth passed away in her home in Michigan, but her legacy has lived on since. In Florence, Massachusetts stands a statue to celebrate her long life dedicated to equality of justice. In the United States Capitol, you will also find a bust of Sojourner Truth. This bust is the first one to honor an African American woman at the Capitol, presented by Michelle Obama in 2009. Sojourner Truth will be remembered for her long life of social justice activism.